The valley had been quiet for 11 minutes. That was the first thing wrong. In a war zone where mortars sang lullabies and small arms fire provided the heartbeat, 11 minutes of silence meant someone was dying or someone was coming. The forward operating base at Coringal sat wedged between two limestone ridges like a fist pressed into a wound, and the soldiers inside had learned to read the quiet like prophets read smoke. Staff Sergeant Marcus Reeves crouched behind a HESCO barrier, his rifle barrel tracking shadows that didn't exist yet. His radio crackled once, twice, then fell silent. The Taliban owned these mountains the way wolves owned winter, and right now they were circling something the Americans couldn't see. Intel had been garbage for 3 days. The supply convoy was 12 hours overdue. Air support had been grounded by weather that turned the sky into a gray wool blanket, and the only thing moving in the valley was the mist that crawled down from the peaks like something alive. Then the mountains screamed. It wasn't thunder. Thunder you could place, could track, could understand. This was something older, something that started deep in the stone and climbed through your boots into your chest. Reeves pressed his eye to his scope and saw nothing but white. The mist had thickened, rolling over itself in waves that defied the wind. His spotter, a kid from Alabama named Tors, was praying under his breath. Not the performative kind of prayer, but the automatic sort that comes when your hindbrain remembers something your frontal lobe forgot. Then they heard the rotors, except they weren't rotors. The sound was wrong, too deep, like someone dragging iron across iron. Reeves keyed his radio. Overwatch, this is Delta 3. We have unknown aerial contact, bearing 270, distance unknown. Visibility 0. Requesting immediate. The transmission cut. Not from interference. The radio simply stopped working, as if something had reached through the air and strangled the signal. Tors grabbed his arm, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. He wasn't looking at the sky. He was looking at the mist, at the place where the mist was beginning to glow, not with fire but with something colder. The kind of light you see on old instruments before they die. And then, through the wall of gray, bleeding contrails of orange and red, trailing hydraulic fluid and fuel like arterial spray, the A-10 Warthog dropped out of the cloud base at 400 feet. One engine completely gone, the other screaming like a wounded animal, and someone on the radio. A voice they didn't recognize, calm as Sunday morning, said, "Phantom 2-1, inbound. I've got your smoke, coming in hot." Nobody called for her. Nobody knew she was coming, but she came anyway. The A-10 screamed over the valley floor with its nose pointed at the earth like a prayer, trailing black smoke that twisted into Arabic script against the white sky. Reeves watched it clear the western ridge by maybe 30 feet, close enough that he could see the carbon scoring on the titanium bathtub that cradled the cockpit, close enough to see the panel flapping loose beneath the starboard wing. The aircraft was dying. Anyone with eyes could see that. One engine was completely shredded, turbine blades scattered across 20 miles of Afghan highland. The other was running on borrowed time and rage, spooling up and down like a cardiac arrhythmia. But the pilot wasn't pulling up. The Warthog dropped lower, hugging the terrain with the kind of intimacy that separates the living from the dead by milliseconds and centimeters. Reeves had seen plenty of close air support in his 3 deployments, had watched Vipers dance and Apache prowl, but he had never seen anything fly like this. It wasn't flying. It was falling with intent. The Taliban positions that had been invisible moments before suddenly announced themselves with tracer fire, green lines stitching up from the eastern ridge in patterns that would have been beautiful if they weren't designed to kill. The A-10 didn't evade. It adjusted, a subtle roll that put the damaged wing high and the good engine low. And then the GA-U-8 Avenger cannon beneath the nose opened up with a sound that wasn't a sound so much as it was the tearing of reality. 70 rounds per second of 30mm depleted uranium hate, each shell the size of a beer bottle, turning rock and flesh and fighting positions into physics demonstrations. The BRRRRRT was felt before it was heard, a vibration that traveled through the ground and into bone. Tors was laughing or crying. Reeves couldn't tell which. The gun run lasted 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, the eastern ridge stopped existing as a tactical problem. The A-10 was done. Whatever deal the pilot had made with physics was coming due. The aircraft pulled up, clawing for altitude with one engine and a prayer black smoke pouring from the dead turbine like blood from a severed artery. It cleared the base perimeter by maybe 100 feet, wings wobbling, nose hunting for level. Reeves could see the tail section now, could see the horizontal stabilizers flexing in ways they were never designed to flex. The pilot was going to try to bring it down. Here. In the valley, on terrain that had killed better pilots in better aircraft. Phantom 2-1, this is Coringal Actual, the radio crackled, the base commander's voice tight with something between awe and horror. You are not cleared for landing. Repeat, not cleared. Terrain is unsecure, winds are actual. Phantom 2-1. The voice that came back was female, young, and carried an accent that might have been Texas or might have been Oklahoma, softened by adrenaline into something universal. I'm not asking permission. I'm informing you of my intention. I've got wounded aboard and I'm out of sky. Recommend you clear the northern approach and get a dock ready. Wounded aboard, the words hung in the air like a hex. A-10s were single-seat aircraft. There was no aboard, there was only the pilot. The Warthog came around in a turn that looked like it was held together by willpower alone, gear dropping with a hydraulic groan that Reeves could hear from 300 yards away. The nose wheel came down crooked. The starboard main gear didn't come down at all, just a jagged stump where the assembly should have been. The pilot didn't abort. She lined up on the dirt strip that passed for a runway, the strip that was barely long enough for a Cessna on a good day, and brought that dying machine down like she was parking a car. The landing was ugly and perfect. The good gear caught dirt and the aircraft slewed right, tail swinging wide, the wingtip with the missing gear carving a furrow in the earth deep enough to plant trees. Sparks fountained up where metal met stone, and for a moment it looked like the whole thing would cartwheel, would come apart in a bloom of fuel and fire. But the pilot cut the working engine and stood on the brakes with everything she had. And somehow, impossibly, the A-10 shuddered to a stop 50 feet from the perimeter wire, listing to one side like a ship taking on water, smoke pouring from both engines now, the canopy already cracking open. The figure that climbed out was small, compact, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had just spent the last 20 minutes convincing a dead aircraft to stay alive through sheer force of personality. She dropped from the cockpit to the wing and then to the ground, not bothering with the ladder, and Reeves got his first good look at her. She couldn't have been more than 5'4", maybe 130 pounds soaking wet, dark hair plastered to her skull beneath the helmet she pulled off as she walked. Her flight suit was soaked through with sweat and hydraulic fluid, and there was blood on her left sleeve, though she didn't seem to notice or care. She walked with a limp, favoring her right leg, but her face was calm, almost serene, the face of someone who had just done something impossible and was already moving on to the next thing. The base medic reached her first, a Navy corpsman named Liu who had seen enough trauma to fill 3 lifetimes. "Ma'am, you said you had wounded." "Negative," she said, her voice quiet now, almost gentle. "I lied, thought you'd clear me faster if you thought someone was bleeding." Liu stared at her. Reeves stared at her. Half the base stared at her. She looked back at them with dark eyes that had gone somewhere else and come back changed. "Didn't want to bother anyone," she said. "But I heard you boys were having a bad day." Her name was Captain Isadora Vance, call sign Revenant, and nobody at Coringal had ever heard of her. That should have been the second wrong thing, but by the time anyone thought to question it, she was already inside the wire, already sitting in the TOC with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in her hands, already explaining to the incredulous base commander how she had been returning from a solo reconnaissance run when her aircraft took fire over the Pech Valley. How she had lost one engine to a lucky RPG shot, how the other had started eating itself from the inside out, how every instrument in the cockpit had decided to quit at the same time, except for the altimeter and her watch. How she had been 40 miles out with nowhere to go but down when she picked up the distress beacon from Coringal and decided that if she was going to crash anyway, She might as well crash somewhere useful. The commander, a lieutenant colonel named Harding who had 3 bronze stars and the tired eyes of a man who had stopped being surprised by anything years ago, listened to this explanation with the expression of someone trying to solve a math problem that kept changing its own variables. "Captain," he said slowly, "you flew a critically damaged aircraft through a storm front over hostile territory with no functioning navigation equipment to provide close air support for a base you had no contact with, based on a distress beacon that we haven't activated in 6 days." Vance took a sip of her cold coffee and nodded. "Yes, sir. And you did this without clearing it with CAOC, without a forward air controller, without so much as a radio call until you were 30 seconds from guns. Didn't seem like there was time for paperwork, sir." Harding looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the wreckage of her A-10 was still smoking, still bleeding fluids onto the dirt. Maintenance crews were already swarming it, shaking their heads, taking pictures like they were documenting a miracle or a crime scene. "Captain, what unit are you assigned to?" That was when her face changed, just for a second, just long enough for Reeves, who was standing by the door because someone had to pull security and he wanted to hear this, to see something move behind her eyes. Something old and tired and maybe a little bit sad. 476th Fighter Squadron, sir, out of Moody," Harding frowned. "The 476th is flying Vipers now. They transitioned out of Warthogs 8 months ago." "Yes, sir." "So what are you doing in an A-10? Vance set down her coffee cup with the careful precision of someone setting down something much heavier. "Someone has to, sir." The silence that followed was the kind that is weight, that presses on your chest and makes you count your own heartbeats. Outside, the mountains were quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. The kind that comes after the storm, after the violence, when the world is still remembering how to breathe. Reeves watched Captain Vance sit in that canvas chair, watched the way her hands didn't shake even though they should have, watched the way she looked at nothing in particular with eyes that had seen too much sky. He had been in country long enough to recognize the look. It was the look of someone who had died and come back, not once but many times, until the membrane between living and haunting had worn so thin you could see through it. The other soldiers started calling her the ghost girl before the sun went down. Not to her face, nobody was that stupid, but in the whispered conversations that happen in fighting holes and behind supply crates, the name spread like a virus. The ghost girl who came out of nowhere. The ghost girl who saved the valley. The ghost girl who flew a dead plane through a wall of lead and brought it down like she was landing on a carrier deck, instead of a dirt strip in hell's waiting room. But Reeves, who had been in the army long enough to know that every ghost story starts with something real, started asking questions. He asked the comm guys if they had any record of her radio calls. They showed him the logs. Every transmission from Phantom 2-1 was there, timestamp verified, but when they tried to trace the routing, the signal path didn't make sense. It was like she had been broadcasting from everywhere and nowhere, like her voice had simply appeared in their headsets without bothering with the intervening physics. He asked the intelligence NCO to pull her service record. The system came back with a file so redacted it looked like a crossword puzzle made of black ink. Name, rank, serial number, and then 30 pages of darkness. He asked the maintenance chief how bad the Warthog really was. The chief, a warrant officer named Kowalski who had been fixing aircraft since before Reeves was born, took him out to the flight line at dusk and showed him. The A-10 looked like it had been used as target practice by a vindictive god. The missing engine was obvious, just a scorched cavity where 18,000 pounds of thrust used to live, but the rest of it was worse. The wing spar on the damaged side had a crack running through it that should have folded the whole structure in flight. The hydraulic lines were shredded, leaking 3 different colors of fluid onto the dirt. The flight computer had a hole punched through it that looked suspiciously like a bullet entry wound. The fuel tanks were so close to empty that Kowalski couldn't figure out how she had made it 10 miles, let alone 40. "Sir," Kowalski said, his voice quiet with something like reverence, "this aircraft should not fly. I don't mean it shouldn't have flown. I mean it violates the fundamental principles of aviation. The math doesn't work. The physics doesn't work. She held this thing together with pure spite. Reeves looked at the wreckage, at the blood smeared on the ejection seat, at the worn patch on the canopy rail where someone had rubbed it for luck so many times the paint was gone. How long has she been flying this bird? Kowalski pulled up the tail number on his tablet, then frowned. That's weird. According to the database, this aircraft was decommissioned 14 months ago. Structural fatigue. It's supposed to be in the boneyard at Davis-Monthan. Reeves felt something cold walk up his spine. Pull up her photo from her service record. Kowalski's frown deepened, but he navigated through the system until he found the personnel file, the one that was mostly redacted. There was a photo. Standard military portrait, dress blues, American flag in the background. Captain Isadora Vance stared out from the screen with dark eyes and a small, careful smile. But it was the date stamp at the bottom that made Reeves's blood turn to ice water. The photo was 7 years old. In it, Vance looked exactly the same as she did right now, sitting in the TOC with her cold coffee and her quiet voice. Not similar. Identical. Like time had simply decided she wasn't worth the effort and had walked around her instead. The ghost girl. Reeves was starting to understand why. That night Vance slept in the transient quarters, a plywood box with a cot and a space heater that barely worked. Nobody bothered her. Word had spread through the base with the efficiency of a military rumor mill operating at peak performance. The pilot was untouchable, unquestionable, and possibly unreal. Soldiers gave her a respectful distance, the kind you give to unexploded ordnance or chaplains who have seen too much. But Reeves couldn't let it go. At 0300, when the base was as quiet as it ever got, when even the guards were half asleep on their feet, he found himself standing outside her quarters with a cup of actually hot coffee and a question that had been eating at him since the maintenance chief showed him that tail number. He knocked quietly, almost hoping she wouldn't answer. She opened the door on the second knock, fully dressed, boots laced like she had been waiting or like she never slept. "Staff Sergeant," she said, taking the coffee without asking why he was there. "Can't sleep. Could ask you the same thing, ma'am." She smiled, a small thing that didn't reach her eyes. "Sleep's overrated, gives you dreams." They stood there for a moment, the cold mountain air pressing in around them, carrying the smell of diesel and dust and the particular scent that only military bases in war zones have, a mixture of fear and boredom and the chemical tang of things that are designed to burn. "You want to ask me something," Vance said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Ask it." Reeves took a breath. In his 3 deployments he had learned when to shut up and when to speak. This felt like the kind of moment that could go either way. "That aircraft of yours, it's supposed to be in the boneyard, and your service photo, it's 7 years old but you look the same." She finished his sentence, her voice flat. "Yeah, I know." "How is that possible?" Vance looked past him, toward the flight line, toward the hulk of her A-10 sitting in the dark like a monument to impossible things. When she spoke, her voice was quieter than he had heard it yet, barely louder than the wind. "How much do you know about the 476th Staff Sergeant?" "Not much, ma'am. Fighter squadron out of Moody. Used to fly Warthogs, now flying Vipers. We flew Warthogs in Syria, 2018. Close air support for a special forces team that got caught in an ambush outside Raqqa. I was leading a 2-ship, me and my wingman, a kid named Carver. Good pilot. Better than me, probably. We got the call and we went in low, under the SAM envelope, right into the teeth of it." She paused, took a sip of coffee, her hands steady as stone. "Carver took a hit. Lucky shot from a Zu-23 right through the cockpit, killed him instantly. I watched his bird go down, watched it hit the ground and come apart like a toy, and something in me just broke, or maybe it didn't break, maybe it crystallized." Reeves didn't interrupt. You don't interrupt ghost stories. "I went back in, alone. Emptied every round I had into that position, into the surrounding positions, into anything that looked like it might shoot back. By the time I pulled up, I was flying on fumes and adrenaline and this feeling that I couldn't quite name. Like I had crossed some kind of threshold and couldn't find my way back. The Special Forces guys got out. All of them. But Carver was still dead, and I was still flying, and it didn't feel fair. She looked at him now, and her eyes were the color of smoke. After that, things got strange. I'd take damage that should have killed me, and I'd walk away. I'd fly missions that should have been impossible, and I'd come back. People started talking, started calling me Revenant. At first, I thought it was just a call sign, just another piece of squadron mythology. But then I started noticing things. I wasn't getting older, not the way I should. And the aircraft I flew, they started lasting longer than they should, like they were borrowing something from me or I was borrowing something from them. Like we were stuck in the same loop, the same moment, trying to make up for the one mission that went wrong. The wind picked up, carrying voices that weren't there. Reeves felt the hair on his arm stand up. "So what are you, ma'am?" Vance smiled again, sad and knowing. "I'm what happens when you don't let go, Staff Sergeant. I'm what happens when you love something so much that even death can't make you quit. I'm a pilot who couldn't save her wingman, so she decided to save everyone else instead, even if it means flying forever." She handed him back the empty coffee cup. "Get some sleep, Staff Sergeant. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." She closed the door quietly, leaving Reeves standing in the dark with a cup and a story that he would never tell anyone because nobody would believe him. But he would remember it. They all would. By dawn, the maintenance crews had done what they could with Vance's A-10. It would never fly again, not really, but they had patched it enough to make it look less like a crime scene and more like a wounded warrior resting. Kowalski had even painted over the worst of the scoring, a gesture that felt less like maintenance and more like a burial rite. Vance stood beside the aircraft as the sun came up over the eastern ridge, one hand resting on the fuselage like she was saying goodbye to an old friend. Reeves watched her from a distance, watched the way the light caught her face and made her look both young and ancient at the same time. The base was stirring now, the daily rhythm of a war zone kicking into gear. Patrols were forming up, supplies were being inventoried, and someone in the mess tent was burning breakfast with the enthusiasm of a person who had given up caring about food safety months ago. But everyone found a moment to look at the pilot and her broken plane, to nod or salute, or just stand there in silent acknowledgement of something they couldn't quite name. Lieutenant Colonel Harding came out to the flight line with a folder under his arm and the expression of a man who had spent the night on the phone with people who didn't believe him. He stopped a respectful distance from Vance, waiting for her to notice him. When she turned, he held out the folder. "Your orders, Captain." Vance took the folder, opened it, scanned the contents with the speed of someone who had read 1,000 sets of orders and knew how to spot the important parts. She closed it, handed it back. "They want me back at Moody." "They want you in front of a board of inquiry," Harding corrected gently. "You flew an unauthorized mission in a decommissioned aircraft through restricted airspace. The Air Force tends to frown on that sort of thing." "Yes, sir." "They're also recommending you for a Silver Star, the Special Forces team you saved, because apparently you saved a Special Forces team before you saved us," they put in a citation. "Said you came out of nowhere, guns blazing, and bought them enough time to extract." Vance didn't react. Reeves, watching from near the HESCO barriers, wondered if she even could anymore, if whatever had happened to her in Syria had burned away the part of her that felt pride or fear or any of the normal things that keep people human. "Will you go?" Harding asked. "To the inquiry." Vance looked at her aircraft, at the Warthog that had carried her through impossible skis and impossible missions, and something in her expression shifted. "Not much, just enough." "I don't know, sir. Part of me thinks I should. Face the music. Let them ground me properly this time. But another part of me thinks that if I stop flying, if I let them take this away, then Carver died for nothing. Then all of this," she gestured at the valley, at the base, at the mountains that had tried to kill them all, "means nothing." Harding was quiet for a moment, then said something that Reeves would remember for the rest of his life. "Maybe it's not about what it means, Captain. Maybe it's about what you've already done. Maybe you've paid that debt 100 times over, and the only person who doesn't know it is you." Vance turned to look at him, and for the first time since she had climbed out of that cockpit, her face showed something raw, something unguarded. "How do you know when you've paid enough, sir?" "You don't," Harding said quietly. That's the thing about guilt. It doesn't come with a receipt, but at some point you have to decide whether you're flying for them or for yourself. And if it's for yourself, then maybe it's okay to land. The sun was fully up now, burning off the mist, turning the valley into shades of gold and amber. Somewhere in the distance, a patrol was moving out, boots on stone, voices on the radio, the eternal rhythm of soldiers doing soldier things. Vance stood there for a long moment, her hand still on the fuselage of her aircraft, and then she did something that surprised everyone. She saluted the A-10. A proper salute, crisp and formal, the kind you give to a flag or a coffin or a memorial wall. The kind you give when you're saying goodbye to something that mattered. Then she turned to Harding and said, "I'll go to the inquiry, sir, but I'm not done flying, not yet, just need to find a bird that's still breathing." Harding smiled, a small, tired thing. "There's always another bird, Captain. That's the beauty and the curse of this job." Vance nodded, and Reeves thought he saw her smile too, just a little. Then she walked away from the aircraft, limping slightly, her flight suit still stained with hydraulic fluid and blood, and she didn't look back. By noon, a Chinook had arrived to take her out, along with a handful of other personnel who were rotating back to Bagram. The entire base turned out to watch her leave, not in formation, but in the casual clusters that soldiers form when they want to see something without making it official. Vance shook hands with Harding, with Liu the corpsman, with Kowalski the maintenance chief. She stopped in front of Reeves last, and for a moment they just looked at each other, two people who had seen different versions of the same war and had somehow ended up in the same place at the same time. "Take care of yourself, Staff Sergeant," she said. "You too, ma'am." "And ma'am," he hesitated, then said it anyway, "thank you for coming out of nowhere." She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. "I didn't come out of nowhere, Staff Sergeant. I came from exactly where I needed to be." Then she walked to the Chinook, climbed aboard with the others, and the ramp closed behind her. The helicopter lifted off in a storm of dust and noise, rotors beating the air into submission, and Reeves watched it climb and turn and disappear over the southern ridge. Within an hour, it felt like she had never been there at all, like the whole thing had been a story they told themselves to make sense of the fact that they were still alive. But the Warthog remained on the flight line, a monument to impossible things. And at night, when the base was quiet, soldiers would walk past it and touch the fuselage just once, like a talisman, like a prayer, like a promise. 3 months later, Reeves was back stateside, processing out at Fort Benning, when he saw the news report on the rec room television. A cargo plane had gone down in the Hindu Kush, ambushed by insurgents during an emergency supply run. The crew had survived the crash but was pinned down, taking fire from 3 sides. No air support available due to weather. No quick reaction force close enough to reach them in time. It should have been a massacre. It should have been another tragedy to add to the long list of tragedies that wars accumulate like debts. But then, according to the ground force commander who was interviewed afterward, a single A-10 Warthog had appeared out of the cloud cover, engines screaming, guns hot, and had turned the ambush into a rout. The pilot had made multiple gun runs, danger close, close enough that the soldiers on the ground could feel the heat from the cannon fire. Close enough to see the aircraft was already damaged, trailing smoke, flying on guts and geometry. The pilot had stayed on station until a rescue helicopter arrived, had escorted it in and out, and had then disappeared back into the weather without waiting for acknowledgement or thanks. The reporter, a polished woman who had probably never been closer to a war zone than a hotel in Kabul, asked the commander if they knew who the pilot was. The commander, an army captain with a fresh purple heart and eyes that had seen too much, smiled and said, "Call sign was Phantom 21, but we just called her the Revenant. She's got a habit of showing up when you need her most. Some of the guys think she's a ghost. Me? I think she's something better. I think she's what we all wish we could be, someone who can't stop fighting for the people who can't fight for themselves." The reporter asked if the pilot had filed a flight plan, if there was any official record of her presence. The commander's smile widened. "Ma'am, if the Revenant filed flight plans, she wouldn't be the Revenant." The segment ended, cutting to commercial, and Reeves sat there in the rec room with his discharge papers in his lap, and a strange feeling in his chest that might have been hope or might have been something older, something that didn't have a name in English. He thought about Captain Isadora Vance, about the way she had looked standing next to her broken aircraft at dawn, about the things she had said in the darkness outside her quarters. He thought about the debt she believed she owed, the debt she was still trying to pay. And he realized that maybe Harding had been wrong. Maybe you never know when you've paid enough. Maybe some debts aren't meant to be paid at all. Maybe they're meant to be carried, transformed into something else, something that looks like duty or love or the refusal to let the dead stay dead. He folded his discharge papers carefully, put them in his pocket, and walked out into the Georgia sunlight. Somewhere in some war zone on some impossible mission, a pilot named Vance was flying. She would always be flying, because some people don't land. They just find new skis to haunt, new battles to fight, new reasons to stay airborne. And maybe that's not a curse. Maybe that's a kind of grace. Years later, when Reeves was teaching tactics at the Ranger School, he would sometimes tell his students about the ghost girl of Coringle. He would tell them about the A-10 that shouldn't have flown, about the pilot who came out of nowhere, about the valley that went quiet and then erupted with the sound of salvation. Some students would believe him. Others would think it was just another war story, embellished and polished until it shined like a lie. But the believers, the ones who understood that war creates spaces where the impossible becomes mandatory, they would ask him, "Is she still out there, Sergeant?" And Reeves would look at them with the expression of a man who knows something true and terrible and beautiful, and he would say, "I don't know, but I hope so, because as long as she's flying, someone's coming home." That was the legacy of Captain Isadora Vance, call sign Revenant, not a medal or a commendation or a place in the history books. Just the knowledge, passed from soldier to soldier like a secret, that somewhere in the thin air between heaven and earth, a pilot who couldn't let go was still keeping watch. The wars came and went. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, places whose names would blur together in the collective memory of a nation that had been at war so long it forgot what peace looked like. Soldiers rotated through, did their time, came home or didn't. Pilots flew and died and were replaced by other pilots who would also fly and die. The machinery of modern warfare ground on, indifferent and eternal. But the stories persisted. In every theater, in every base, there were whispers of the Revenant. A pilot who showed up when things were worst, when the situation was foobar and the odds were impossible. Sometimes it was an A-10. Sometimes it was an F-16 or a Super Hornet or, in one particularly strange account, an old A-4 Skyhawk that shouldn't have even been in the inventory anymore. The aircraft changed, but the call sign didn't. Phantom 2-1. Always the same voice on the radio, calm and steady, with that hint of Texas or Oklahoma smoothed down by adrenaline. The official channels denied her existence. There was no pilot named Vance in any current roster, no aircraft with the tail numbers that survivors reported, no flight plans, no mission logs, no paper trail to follow. The Air Force Public Affairs Office, when pressed by journalists who smelled a good story, would politely explain that combat can be confusing, that call signs get mixed up, that what looks like one pilot might be several different pilots whose actions have been compressed in memory into a single mythology. They were probably right. Probably. But the soldiers who had seen her, who had felt the wash of her gun runs and heard her voice in their headsets when they were sure they were going to die, they knew better. They knew the difference between confusion and certainty. They knew what they had seen. And they told their stories to anyone who would listen, adding to the legend, building it up like a cathedral made of words and faith, and the desperate human need to believe that someone, somewhere, was watching over them. Reeves followed the stories even after he retired. He would see mentions in forums where veterans gathered, threads that would start with anyone else ever encounter Phantom 2-1, and then spiral into dozens of accounts, each one slightly different but all hitting the same notes. Impossible arrival, desperate situation, perfect execution, mysterious departure. He collected them like some people collect stamps or coins, not out of obsession, but out of something closer to obligation. He felt like he owed her that much to remember, to document, to make sure that when the last person who had seen her flew their final mission, there would still be a record, a proof that she had existed, that she had mattered, that she had saved more lives than any medal citation could ever capture. In 2031, he published a book about her. It was a small thing, self-published, mostly distributed through military channels and veteran networks. He called it the Revenant Protocol, and in it, he compiled every account he could verify, every story that had enough detail to feel real. He included his own experience at Korangal, though he changed some names and dates to protect people who didn't want to be associated with ghost stories. He included the incident with the cargo plane in the Hindu Kush. He included accounts from Marines in Helmand Province, from SEALs in the Somali Plains, from a convoy of National Guard engineers who swore that an A-10 had saved them from an IED ambush even though there were no A-10s assigned to that sector. The book didn't sell many copies. Maybe a few thousand, mostly to people who had their own revenant stories and wanted to see if their experience matched up with others. But it did one thing that Reeves hadn't expected. It brought her back. Not physically. She didn't show up at his door or call him on the phone, but the act of compiling the stories, of giving them weight and structure and permanence, seemed to crystallize something. After the book came out, the sightings increased. Or maybe they didn't increase. Maybe people just felt more comfortable reporting them now that there was a framework, a vocabulary, a way to talk about what they had seen without feeling crazy. Pilots started wearing patches with a ghostly A-10 and the words Phantom 21 stitched underneath. Ground units started painting the call sign on their vehicles, a talisman against bad luck. At one Air Force base in Qatar, someone erected a small memorial, just a plaque really, that read, "In memory of Captain Isadora Vance and all pilots who refused to land." It was unofficial, tolerated by command staff who understood that sometimes you have to let soldiers have their myths. Reeves visited that memorial once, on a trip back to the Middle East as a contractor. He stood in front of it for a long time, reading the inscription, thinking about the woman he had met for less than 24 hours but who had somehow changed the trajectory of his understanding of what courage looked like. He thought about her words, "I'm what happens when you don't let go." And he wondered if she had ever figured out how to let go, or if she was still out there somewhere, still flying, still trying to pay a debt that couldn't be paid. He hoped in a way that she was. Because the alternative, that she had crashed somewhere remote and died alone, that her body was still strapped into some cockpit in some canyon that nobody would ever find, was too sad to contemplate. As he stood there, a young pilot approached, a lieutenant who couldn't have been more than 25, fresh-faced and eager in the way that people are before war sands them down into something harder. She noticed Reeves reading the plaque and smiled. "You believe in her, sir?" Reeves looked at the lieutenant, at her name tag that read TORRES, and felt a strange symmetry in the moment, like the universe was making a point he was too slow to catch. "I met her once," he said. "Long time ago in Afghanistan. She saved my life and a bunch of other lives, then disappeared before anyone could thank her properly." Tor's eyes widened. "Seriously, what was she like?" Reeves thought about how to answer that, how to compress the complexity of Captain Vance into words that would make sense to someone who hadn't been there. "She was tired," he said finally, "and she was brave, and she cared more about doing the right thing than about whether anyone would remember her for it." Which is maybe the definition of a hero when you think about it. Tors nodded slowly, processing this. "I hope I get to meet her someday, even if it means things have gone really wrong." Reeves smiled. "If you meet her, Lieutenant, tell her that Staff Sergeant Reeves says thank you, and tell her that we're all still watching the sky." Tors saluted, sharp and sincere, and walked away. Reeves stayed a little longer, then left the memorial and went back to his temporary life, his temporary work, the temporary peace that comes between wars. But he kept watching the sky. They all did. In 2034, the United States withdrew its last combat troops from the regions it had occupied for nearly 3 decades. The wars officially were over. Bases were dismantled, equipment was packed up or destroyed, and the mountains and valleys that had been contested with such ferocity were returned to the people who lived there, to make of them what they would. The news covered it with the perfunctory attention of a media exhausted by conflict, and then moved on to other stories. But in the final weeks of the withdrawal, something happened that didn't make the news but spread through military networks like wildfire. A rearguard unit, tasked with covering the final evacuation from a remote outpost, came under attack. Heavy attack. The kind of attack that happens when an enemy knows you're leaving and wants to make a point about who really won. The unit was outnumbered, outgunned, and running low on ammunition. Air support had been pulled back weeks earlier. The nearest quick reaction force was too far away. It should have been a slaughter. And then, out of the clear blue sky, an A-10 Warthog appeared. It made one pass, guns blazing, chewing up the attacking positions with the brutal efficiency that only a Warthog can deliver. Then it came around for a second pass and a third and kept coming until the attack broke and the enemy melted back into the hills. The unit made it to their extraction point, loaded onto helicopters, and flew away from that country for the last time. The pilot, when asked for identification, said only, "Phantom 2-1. Safe skis, gentlemen. It's been an honor." Then she was gone back into the blue and nobody ever saw her again. Or maybe they did. Maybe she's still up there, patrolling skis that no one remembers, fighting battles that no one records. Maybe she found a way to let go and is finally at rest. Or maybe she became something else entirely, something that exists in the space between story and truth, between memory and myth. Maybe she's the thing that pilots whisper about before a dangerous mission, the good luck charm that everyone knows isn't real but nobody wants to dismiss. Maybe she's what we all become, eventually, if we care about something enough to let it consume us. Not a ghost, but a presence, a weight in the air, a promise that someone is watching. Reeves died in 2041, peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by family and the quiet dignity that comes to men who have done hard things and found a way to live with them. His obituary mentioned his military service, his time as an instructor, his book about unconventional tactics and the psychology of modern warfare. It didn't mention the Revenant, but at his funeral, a group of veterans who had served with him stood together and told stories. And one of them, Tors, now a major, graying at the temples with her own collection of scars and memories, told the story of the ghost girl of Korangal, the pilot who came out of nowhere and changed everything. She told it the way Reeves had told it to her, word for word, like a prayer that had been passed down through generations. And when she finished, they all looked up at the sky, at the thin contrails of jets passing overhead, and they wondered. Because that's the thing about legends. They don't end. They just change shape, adapting to new times and new needs, becoming whatever people require them to be. Captain Isadora Vance, call sign Revenant, became that kind of legend. Not a story about a person, but a story about persistence, about duty, about the refusal to abandon the people who depend on you even when every rational part of your brain is screaming that it's time to land, time to rest, time to let someone else take the watch. She became the answer to the question that every soldier asks in the dark hours. If things go wrong, if I'm alone, if there's no help coming, will anyone fight for me? And the answer, whispered in ready rooms and passed along in emails and carved into the metal of memorial plaques, was, yes, the Revenant will come. She always comes. Years turned into decades. The people who had known her, who had met her or heard her voice or felt the shockwave of her guns, they aged and retired and eventually passed on, taking their memories with them. The wars they had fought became history, then became footnotes, then became the kind of thing that people studied in classrooms without really understanding. New conflicts arose, new technologies, new ways of killing and dying. The A-10 Warthog was finally, officially, permanently retired from service, replaced by drones and hypersonic missiles, and all the clean, distant ways of making war that don't require someone to sit in a cockpit and bleed. But the stories remained. They mutated, evolved, took on characteristics that didn't quite match the original. In some versions, Vance wasn't a pilot at all but an AI, a ghost in the machine, a targeting algorithm that had gained sentience and decided to protect instead of destroy. In others, she was an angel, literally, sent by whatever God watches over soldiers to balance the scales of cosmic justice. In still others, she was just a very good pilot who happened to be in the right place at the right time, over and over, until coincidence hardened into mythology. The truth, whatever it was, became irrelevant. What mattered was the idea of her, the concept that somewhere in the vast machinery of war, there was one cog that spun backwards, one algorithm that refused to calculate casualties, one person, or ghost or angel or whatever she had become, who chose mercy over mission parameters every single time. That idea had power. It kept people going when logic said to quit. It made them braver than they had any right to be. It reminded them that the purpose of all the violence, all the sacrifice, all the terrible compromises that war demands was supposed to be protection, saving people, bringing them home. And if a dead pilot in an obsolete aircraft could remember that, could embody it so completely that even death couldn't stop her, then maybe the rest of them could too. So the legend persisted, passed from generation to generation like a torch or a burden or a blessing. And sometimes on clear days when the sky was the particular shade of blue that hurts to look at, pilots would glance at their instruments and see a ghost return on their radar. Just for a second, just long enough to make them wonder, and they would smile or salute or simply nod in acknowledgement and then get back to work. Because that's what you do. You fly the mission. You protect the people who can't protect themselves. You refuse to land even when landing would be easier, even when landing would make sense. You keep going. Because somewhere in the thin air between courage and insanity, a pilot named Vance figured out how to turn grief into grace, how to transform one failed mission into 10,000 successes, how to make her call sign mean something more than just a name. Phantom 2-1. The Revenant. The Ghost Girl. The one who comes when you need her most. The one who never, ever lands.